Episode 16. "But what is it?" Calvin demanded. "We know that it's evil, but what is it?" "You have said it," Mrs. Witch's voice rang out. "It is evil. It is the powers of darkness." "But what's going to happen?" Meg's voice trembled. "Oh, please, Mrs. Witch, tell us what's going to happen." "We will continue to fight." Something in Mrs. Witch's voice made all three of the children stand straighter, throwing back their shoulders with determination, looking at the glimmer that was Mrs. Witch with pride and confidence.
"And we're not alone, you know, children,"
came Mrs. Whatsit, the comforter.
"All through the universe it's being fought. All through the cosmos, and but it's a grand and exciting battle. I know it's hard for you to understand about size, but there's very little difference in the size of the tiniest microbe and the greatest galaxy. You think about that, and maybe it won't seem strange to you that some of our very best fighters have come right from your own planet. And it's a little planet, dears, out on the edge of a little galaxy. You can be proud that it's done so well."
"Who have our fighters been?" Calvin asked.
"Oh, you must know them, dear,"
Mrs. Whatsit said. Mrs. Who's spectacles shone out at them triumphantly. "And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not."
"Jesus,"
Charles Wallace said.
"Why, of course, Jesus."
"Of course," Mrs. Whatsit said. "Go on, Charles, love. There were others. All your great artists. They've been lights for us to see by."
"Leonardo da Vinci," Calvin suggested tentatively. "And Michelangelo."
"And Shakespeare," Charles Wallace called out. "And Bach, and Pasteur, and Madame Curie, and Einstein."
Now Calvin's voice rang with confidence. "And Schweitzer, and Gandhi, and Buddha, and Beethoven, and Rembrandt, and St. Francis."
"Now you, Meg,"
Mrs. Whatsit ordered. "Oh, Euclid, I suppose." Meg was in such an agony of impatience that her voice grated irritably. "And Copernicus? But what about Father? Please, what about Father?" "We are going to your father," Mrs. Witch said. "But where is he?" Meg went over to Mrs. Witch and stamped as though she were as young as Charles Wallace. Mrs. Whatsit answered in a voice that was low but quite firm.
"On a planet that has given in. So you must prepare to be very strong."
All traces of cheer had left the happy medium's face. She sat holding the great ball, looking down at the shadow of earth, and a slow tear coursed down her cheek. "I can't stand it any longer," she sobbed. "Watch now, children, watch." Chapter 6. The Happy Medium. Again they focused their eyes on the crystal ball. The earth, with its fearful covering of dark shadow, swam out of view, and they moved rapidly through the Milky Way. And there was the thing again. "Watch," the medium told them. The darkness seemed to seethe and writhe. Was this meant to comfort them? Suddenly there was a great burst of light through the darkness. The light spread out, and where it touched the darkness disappeared. The light spread until the patch of dark thing had vanished, and there was only a gentle shining. And through the shining came the stars, clear and pure. Then, slowly, the shining dwindled until it too was gone, and there was nothing but stars and starlight, no shadows, no fear, only the stars and the clear darkness of space, quite different from the fearful darkness of the thing.
You see, the medium cried, smiling happily, it can be overcome. It is being overcome all the time.
Mrs. Whatsit sighed. A sigh so sad that Meg wanted to put her arms around her and comfort her.
Tell us exactly what happened then, please,
Charles Wallace said in a small voice.
It was a star,
Mrs. Whatsit said sadly.
a star giving up its life in battle with the thing. It won. Oh, yes, my children, it won. But it lost its life in the winning.
Mrs. Witch spoke again. Her voice sounded tired, and they knew that speaking was a tremendous effort for her. It was not so long ago for you, was it? She asked gently. Mrs. Whatsit shook her head. Charles Wallace went up to Mrs. Whatsit.
I see. Now I understand. You were a star once, weren't you?
Mrs. Whatsit covered her face with her hands as though she were embarrassed, and nodded.
And you did what that star just did?
With her face still covered, Mrs. Whatsit nodded again. Charles Wallace looked at her very solemnly.
I should like to kiss you.
Mrs. Whatsit took her hands down from her face and pulled Charles Wallace to her in a quick embrace. He put his arms around her neck and pressed his cheek against hers, and then kissed her. Meg felt that she would have liked to kiss Mrs. Whatsit too, but that after Charles Wallace, anything that she or Calvin did or said would be anticlimax. She contented herself with looking at Mrs. Whatsit, even though she was used to Whatsis's odd get-up, and the very oddness of it was what made her seem so comforting. She realized with a fresh shock that it was not Mrs. Whatsit herself that she was seeing at all. The complete, the true Mrs. Whatsit, Meg realized, was beyond human understanding. What she saw was only the game Mrs. Whatsit was playing. It was an amusing and charming game, a game full of both laughter and comfort, but it was only the tiniest facet of all the things Mrs. Whatsit could be.
I didn't mean to tell you,
Mrs. Whatsit faltered.
I didn't mean ever to let you know. But, oh, my dears, I did so love being a star.
You are still very young, Mrs. Witch said, her voice faintly chiding. The medium sat looking happily at the star-filled sky in her ball, smiling and nodding and chuckling gently. But Meg noticed that her eyes were drooping, and suddenly her head fell forward, and she gave a faint snore.
Poor thing,
Mrs. Whatsit said.
We've worn her out. It's very hard work for her.
Please, Mrs. Whatsit, Meg asked, what happens now? Why are we here? What do we do next? Where is Father? When are we going to him? She clasped her hands pleadingly.
One thing at a time, love,
Mrs. Whatsit said. Mrs. Who cut in. As paredes têm ouvidos. That's Portuguese. Walls have ears.
Yes, let us go outside,
Mrs. Whatsit said.
Come, we'll let her sleep.
But as they turned to go, the medium jerked her head up and smiled at them radiantly.
You weren't going to go without saying goodbye to me, were you?
She asked.
Well, we thought we'd just let you sleep, dear.
Mrs. Whatsit patted the medium's shoulder.
We worked you terribly hard, and we know you must be very tired.
But I was going to give you some ambrosia, or nectar, or at least some tea.
At this, Meg realized that she was hungry. How much time had passed since they had had their bowl of stew, she wondered. But Mrs. Whatsit said,
Oh, thank you, dear, but I think we'd better be going.
They don't need to eat, you know, Charles Wallace whispered to Meg. At least not food the way we do. Eating's just a game with them. As soon as we get organized again, I'd better remind them that they'll have to feed us sooner or later.